I'm sitting here in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, in the remotest place on Earth, Easter Island, or Rapa Nui. It is famous for its giant statues, the Moai, and infamous for the decline of its civilization due to the major deforestation. We're here to film because Easter Island is a good example of a spaceship Earth. Like the Earth, it is cut off from outside help. Up until modern times, it could only rely on the island's resources. To learn from history, we need to know what exactly happened to Easter Island. Between 300 and 1200 years AD, the Polynesians settled on the Easter Island. They named it Te Pito o Te Huena, which means the navel of the world. Anakena is the main beach on Easter Island. It was a landing place of Hotomatua, their first king. Polynesians were among the best seafarers because they used the currents and stars to navigate the sea. To find out more about Easter Island's history, we went to see James Grant Peterkin, the honorary British consul. James was educated at Cambridge University and settled on the island in 2001. Can you tell us more about how Rapa Nui Island looked like before humans arrived?
So the thinking is that prior to human settlement here on Rapa Nui, the island was, of course, uninhabited. It was only really used by nesting birds, and so all of the seabirds in the whole of this eastern part of the Pacific probably used Rapa Nui as their nesting site. And so there would have been tens, if not hundreds of thousands of birds here, and of course a large amount of vegetation and things like that that accompanied these birds during the nesting period. So an island that was covered with trees and a lot of plant life, huge amounts of birds using the island as a nesting site, and of course the seas around the island would have been unfished and therefore full of fish and animals and things like that. So it would have been a very healthy ecosystem prior to human arrival.
So why do you think it changed afterwards?
Well, because man arrived, and so as soon as the humans arrived, they began to change this very well-balanced ecosystem. And so first of all, of course, they hunted the birds and the eggs. They started to chop down much of the vegetation in order to be able to plant the plants that they brought with them. They also started to fish, obviously, the waters around the island. And so this very untouched ecosystem obviously became slightly damaged or certainly affected by the arrival of humans.
So you think it was affected by the arrival of Polynesians or Europeans?
No, so this is the arrival of Polynesians. So long before the Europeans ever found this part of the Pacific, the Polynesians were settling pretty much every single island in the whole of the Pacific. And they had this incredibly successful settlement across the whole of the Pacific, starting out from Southeast Asia, coming through the center of the Pacific, and ultimately reaching these outlying islands such as Rapa Nui in this case, Hawaii in the north of Polynesia, and finally Aotearoa or New Zealand in the southwest corner of Polynesia. And that today has formed the Polynesian Triangle.
Yeah, because they were like the most skillful seafarers.
Exactly, and so people often, obviously everyone knows about the Vikings, but what many people don't know about is the success of the Polynesians in discovering, and not just discovering, but settling all of these remote islands in the Pacific. Ahoakivi was restored in the 1960s by William Malloy.
Those Moai are not facing the land like other statues, but facing the ocean, remembering where they came from. According to the legend, before Hotumatua arrived to the island, he sent 7 explorers. In order to build those statues before the Europeans arrived, the civilization had to be politically and economically stable. Because remember, I went to the exhibition in London. It's called Oceania, and I was impressed when I saw all those canoes and how people just used the stars.
Yeah, so it's the way they were able to navigate, the way they were able to discover islands long before they could see them with their eyes, and the way that they were then able to introduce their culture into these islands. And that's why, incredibly, despite all of the distance, the culture is so similar today in places like Hawaii. The language on Rapa Nui is very similar to that of the Maori language in New Zealand. And so you get these tremendous similarities despite the fact that there are 5,000 or 6,000 miles apart geographically.
They have seen their conflicting dates on when people firstly arrived. So how do you think, when did they arrive and where they came from?
Okay, so I think in questions about the date of when humans first arrived here, there's still a lack of agreement, if you like, amongst the experts. You'll sometimes hear dates as early as 500 or 600, 700 AD, and sometimes even as late as about 1100 AD. I think, as with most things, the real answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But it's not something, carbon dating hasn't been able to find some exact date that says humans arrived in exactly 900 AD or whenever it was. But I think that's probably about the period 800 to 900 AD when Polynesians first found this island. And this is the point that I think where no one's in any doubt at all anymore is the origin of the people that first discovered this island. And that was that they came from another island in Polynesia. It was very much part of this Pacific-wide settlement that they did, and this was simply the easternmost island that the Polynesians arrived to. Everyone knows about Thor Heyerdahl and his slightly sort of out there theories about the fact that Peruvians might have found their way here, or South American Indians might have come across the Pacific. But one has to remember there's no genetic or linguistic evidence to back any kind of South American settlement of Easter Island or anywhere else in the Pacific. It's very much the Polynesians coming from the west that made it as far as Easter Island.
He also had an idea that there were 2 tribes on Easter Island. What is your view about this?
Well, I think sadly experts and particularly linguists have decided that this was really a mistranslation. When Thor Heyerdahl came here in the 50s, he was obviously looking to try and find a better understanding of what had happened here. And some of the island authorities, if you like, the people that were his informants when he was here, gave him some of the information that really there's no archaeological proof to. And one of the things that he came up with was this idea that on Easter Island there had been long ears and short ears, and that there were these 2 differing tribes of people that eventually fought amongst each other, one wiping the other one out. What DNA studies on the island have shown, or haven't, have proven, is that there never has been 2 groups of genetically different people on this island. It's always been this one arrival of Polynesians, and then they sort of subdivided into families and tribes. But there's no evidence to actually show that there ever were these long ears and short ears.
Yeah, I guess it was hard for him in that time to find the evidence of anything.
Well, yeah, so the basic problem he had was linguistic, in that he didn't have anyone on his team that spoke Rapa Nui, for obvious reasons. And here on the island, Chile still hadn't really done anything in terms of taking ownership of the island, and so no one really spoke Spanish, and certainly no English or Norwegian or anything like that.
The 17th and 18th centuries were periods of exploration and discovery by European sailors.
In 1687, the English buccaneer Edward Davis and his crew spotted a low and sandy island, which was probably the burnt grass of Easter Island during summer, or Anakana Beach. Thus, it was later referred as Davy's Land.
1722.
Jacob Roggeveen was the first European who made a contact with the people of Rapa Nui. He arrived here on April 5th, Easter Sunday, and stayed here for a week.
Our latitude by reckoning was 27 degrees, 4 minutes south, and the longitude 266 degrees, 31 minutes. We saw a turtle, floating weed and birds. About the 10th clash in the afternoon watch, the African galley, which was sailing ahead of us, lay to wait for us, making the signal of "Land ahoy!" a low flattish island. We landed on Easter Day 1722, and after an assault by the natives, in which several natives were killed, we were able to make peace with them and investigate the island. At first, these stone figures caused us to be filled with wonder, for we could not understand how it was possible that people who are destitute of heavy or thick timber and also of stout cordage out of which to construct gear had been able to erect them. Nevertheless, some of these statues were a good 30 feet in height and broad in proportion.
Roggeveen estimated that there were about 3,000 inhabitants, though there were probably 10 to 12,000. There were also surprisingly no trees.
The language barrier between early visitors to the island and the islanders was an incredibly complex one, and this goes back all the way from when the first Dutch visitors came, the first outsiders to visit in 1722 on Easter Sunday, that it was very difficult to communicate with the local islanders. And
Yeah, because they have never seen anyone from the other countries.
Exactly, so this was
the Polynesians have arrived.
Exactly. So this was their first experience, if you like, with outsiders, and no one spoke Dutch on the island, and none of the Dutch obviously spoke Rapa Nui. And so for that reason, one has to take with an enormous pinch of salt exactly the kind of information that some of those early visitors. I mean, much of what they record is fascinating because they were able to see the island at a time when obviously none of us were around. But at the same time, some of the interactions they had with the islanders would have been extremely difficult to really know what was being said on either side. And so when questions were asked, for example, between Cook and the islanders 50 years later, one has to be careful about some of the answers that were given because, you know, how well did the islanders really understand what they were being asked?
Archaeological evidence shows that by 1650, the largest palm trees were extinct. Easter Island was the barren land we see today. The ability to sail to Easter Island in canoes without 18th century sextants and chronometers must have made early explorers wonder as to how they did it. The Polynesians were experts at reading the wind, waves, the sun, and at night the stars. Easter Island has a remnant of that celestial knowledge at Ahuhiri Renga.
This aho has a single moai with 2 hands, crematorium and observatory. The observatory was used to help people predict the seasons using the stars. It also allowed people to see when the winter began and when such activities such as fishing were prohibited. The Ahuhuri Arenga Moai looks where the sun rises on the austral winter solstice on June 21st.
The Moai, when first spotted by early Europeans, became something of a mystery. How did they get them there? Were they hewn from the rocks where they stood, or were they transported?
Rano Rarako is where Moai statues were made. They were carved from a unique stone called lapilitaf. It was easier to carve from that stone than from any other rocks on the island. The quarry is about 800 meters long. About 397 statues remain in place, while the total of 1,000 statues were actually carved from this quarry. They were carved in place and moved to the ceremonial stone platforms called aho. At first, the moai were about 3 meters high. Over time, they got slimmer and taller, getting up to 10 meters. The large amount of manpower to do this work may have caused a need to grow more crops and catch more fish. Catching more fish meant building more canoes. This in itself led to deforestation of the island.
To understand more about the religion of the Rapa Nui people, I walked to Aho Tangariki.
Aho Tangariki is the largest stone platform on the Easter Island. The Moai statues were the key part of the cult of ancestor worship. Polynesians would wrap their king in a vegetable fabric and expose his body to the sun and air so it got decomposed. Afterwards, his bones would be collected and brought down to the aho or stone platform. With the use of basalt tools, team of carvers would cut the tuff to shape the moai. They would start with the nose to maintain the symmetry. Then they would add arms, neck and torso. Finally, a large red scoria, called a pukao, or a top knot, would be added to the top. This was a symbol of hierarchy. Islanders also wore their hair in a top knot.
In 1774, Captain James Cook arrived. His men were dispatched to observe the island. He noted that something had changed since Roggeveen's visit in 1722.
I shall now give some farther account of this island, which is undoubtedly the same that Admiral Roggeveen touched at in April 1722, although the description given of it by the authors of that voyage does by no means agree with it now. On the east side, near the sea, they met with 3 platforms of stonework, or rather the ruins of them. On each had stood 4 of those large statues, but they were all fallen down from 2 of them, and also 1 from the 3rd. All except 1 were broken by the fall, or in some measure defaced. In colour, features and language, they bear such an affinity to the people of the more western isles that no one will doubt they have had the same origin. It is extraordinary that the same nation should have spread themselves all over the isles in this vast ocean, from New Zealand to this island, which is almost 1/4 part of the circumference of the globe.
Do you think it changed slightly after James Cook visit?
Cook seems to come at a time, he comes in 1774, and this seems to be the time when the island society is starting to go downhill, if you like. He comes across an island that's very poor, the islanders aren't in very good shape. He doesn't think that there are anything like as many islanders on the island as when Roggeveen came 52 years earlier. And so what seems to have taken place is that this change in the society, this change in the dynamic of the island has taken place in this period between Roggeveen's arrival in 1722 and Cook's arrival in 1774.
It seemed like civilization went into decline and mostly all of the Moai were toppled at that time.
Yeah, so the Moai were in the process of being, that was something that Cook witnessed. He saw that some of the Moai had been thrown over, not all of them at this stage, but some of them had been thrown over. And he felt that there was a breakdown in the society of the Rapa Nui. He didn't think that there was this structured, organized society that clearly had to take place for all of the Moai and everything to have been built in the first place.
So why do you think it happened? Why the decline happened by the time of his visit?
Well, the
station, or because they didn't have any food supplies or water?
Yes, well, it seems to be a mix of many factors, and I think also of other factors that it's impossible for us to really measure now 300 years later. Obviously, there's no doubting that the human population on the island got to a large number. Quite how many, we don't really know, but they certainly got to probably over 10,000, up to 12,000 perhaps people, which on a small island is difficult to maintain anyway. They famously cut down many of the trees, and we know this from the Dutch because they arrived here and found very few trees when they visited, but we know now from studies that have been done very recently that there was a large amount of the island that was forested. So many of the trees were cut down, presumably to create space in order to plant their crops, but also perhaps, and as a secondary reason, was to move the statues, because the rollers, the trunks might have served as very good rollers for the Moai. So you've got a lack of resources on the island. You've got more and more people living on this island. You've got the inability of islanders to travel now off the island. They don't have this culture of going to other islands nearby to settle. And so they're, if you like, they're marooned on this small island. And so they start to fight over the remaining resources. And this seems to lead towards something of intertribal warfare, a kind of civil war, if you like. Sorry?
Did cannibalism occur as well?
Well, there are studies that have shown that in a small degree there were examples of cannibalism here on the island. Cannibalism, to be honest, is nothing new in Polynesia. If you study New Zealand or places like Tonga, they were well known amongst the European visitors to practice cannibalism. The question about it here is whether it was out of necessity, whether they literally ran out of food where cannibalism became sort of an option, or whether it becomes a bit more of a cultural thing by which eating the human flesh of perhaps your enemy is the ultimate sort of
Take his soul.
exactly. It was the sort of the ultimate way of sort of conquering him, if you like, or perhaps also in a way of to preserve some of the mana. So this word mana that features a lot in Polynesia, this idea that certain people had this very special sort of power, if you like, and so if a person like that died, apart from building a moai for them, you would also perhaps eat their flesh as a way of absorbing some of their mana. Yeah. Because I think this is the point, that one has to look at Easter Island within a context of the whole of Polynesia. And what all of the other islands in Polynesia had were neighbouring islands that they could go to as soon as they've used up the resources. And this happens on other islands as well. They will use up resources, they will overfish the waters, they will have too many people living on an island, they might start fighting. And then the losing faction, the losing team, if you like, will be forced to go and move to another island and start up a new life there. And so this happened a lot through other islands in Polynesia. It's just that here on Easter Island, it's so remote and so isolated that there's no other island nearby that anyone could go and move to. I mean, the nearest island realistically is Pitcairn, and that's 2,000 miles away. And so, there wasn't a neighbouring island that they could then go and start, using the resources for.
But somehow they managed to arrive by canoes to the Easter Island, such a long way, and then they decided to settle here.
Exactly, but this perhaps suggests why there wasn't this constant traffic between Easter Island and the rest of Polynesia. It's almost like they arrived here, they closed the door behind them, And this is why the culture on Easter Island is so unique and different in a way to the rest of Polynesia. You don't find stone statues like the Moai anywhere else in Polynesia. The language is different in certain respects from the rest of Polynesia. And this seems to be because they isolated themselves, partly due to the distance, but because they found an island that they were able to live on very comfortably for a long period of time.
Yeah, that's why they managed to create something unique, like Moai Statues.
Exactly. So normally on most islands, the Polynesians would just survive. They would live, they would do agriculture, they would fish, they would do everything they needed just to survive and obviously reproduce and continue their lineage down on that island. But here on Easter Island, we see something that's so out of keeping with the rest of Polynesia. You know, they haven't just survived on this island, but they've thrived, you know? I mean, they've thrived because you don't start carving 1,000 stone statues and transporting them all around the island unless you're doing really well, you know, unless things are going so well that you've got so many people and resources that you can actually express your religious views in this way. I think this is the point, that Easter Island is nearly always presented as a story of human failure. It's always about this collapse, it's always about how everything went wrong on Easter Island, but in a way that's missing the point, because Easter Island is really a story about human success. It's the fact that they were able to find this most remote of all remote islands, and they were able to be successful here to the extent that they were able to create this incredible culture that the islanders today are still living, you know, they're still basking in the success, if you like, of their ancestors from, you know, 500 to 1,000 years ago. You know, I mean, the island still depends entirely on the creation of their ancestors.
Yes,
and there's
why
no other island in Polynesia that lives off what their ancestors had produced.
Exactly, that's what brings people to this isolated place, because it's a Moai.
Of course. I mean, if it wasn't for the Moai, no one would come to this island. You wouldn't fly 5.5 hours from South America to come to a rock in the middle of the ocean. I mean, it's a beautiful island, I think, but it's, you know, you would go somewhere else first before you came here. But the fact that it has this unique culture,
Mystified history.
yeah, you know, I mean, and people come, this is the beauty of the island, that people come from literally the whole world to come and visit this island. And so the islanders now, quite rightly, are incredibly proud of what their ancestors created. And there's been this real rebirth of this sort of pride in Rapa Nui culture.
Modern archaeology has shown that war between the tribes was probably less of an issue than has once been thought. However, it is interesting to note that some caves are known as refuge caves and have colorful, sad stories attached to them.
Anakakenga is one of the most attractive and visited caves on the Easter Island. It was created by the flow of lava toward the sea. It is also related to a sad story about forbidden love. A young couple covered the entrance and stayed here until they died.
The toppling of statues suggests that the belief system that revolved around ancestor worship declined due to many factors. This led to the rise of a new cult.
The Birdman of Rapa Nui is a cult and legend. It starts here at the stone village of Orongo. It would have been inhabited only a few days before the Birdman ceremony, or Tangata Mano. The Birdman cult was a death-defying act of personal athletic bravery. It involved swimming in the shark-infested waters and climbing the rocks by its participants in order to be the first to bring the Manutara egg from the Isle of Motunui to Orongo. After the Moai period had ended, this cult grew in popularity. By 18th century, it became dominant. However, in 1860s, due to the civilization decline and slavery, it became a history.
The great Polynesian civilization of Rapa Nui that managed to build these statues were also great cave painters. I traveled to try to see where they learned these skills according to their legends and histories.
Here I am at the most famous cave called Anakai Tangata. This was a place of teaching. This cave may also have been a small boatyard where canoes were sewn together. Anakaitangata is the best place to admire cave paintings. Most of them are dedicated to Manatara, or a seagull, a bird that nestles on the islets next to the Orongo. The ancient rites that are depicted here mostly dedicated to a birdman cult. Sadly, some of the cave paintings are in decline today.
Rapa Nui was discovered by risk-takers, many of whom were probably lost at sea. Imagine setting off, searching for islands to the southeast, not knowing if any even existed. At least one explorer found Easter Island and returned home to provide settlers with its location. At some point, Easter Islanders were so successful that they found time to build statues to their ancestors. These were the great Moai, wonders of the world. With that success came a problem that one day all humans will face. The islanders, to some extent, overshot their resources. Like the Earth, they were cut off from outside help. It is a sobering message from history that all of humanity needs to learn.